The scissors glinted in the lamplight as my father reached for my wrist. I was 17 years old, and in exactly 3 minutes, I would lose my voice forever. Or at least, that's what they thought. What would you do if you woke up one morning and knew that by nightfall, you'd never be allowed to speak again? Not because of an illness, not because of an accident, but because of a family tradition that had stolen the voices of women for 4 generations. A tradition so deeply woven into our lives that questioning it was like questioning gravity itself. My name is Maya Chen, and I'm about to tell you how I used a high school elective to start a revolution that would tear my family apart and put half of them in jail. How a simple class in American Sign Language became the secret weapon that 23 girls used to fight back against a tradition that had silenced their mothers, their aunts, their grandmothers. How speaking up one time at a wedding changed everything. But here's the thing. Nobody tells you about standing up against traditions that have existed longer than you've been alive. The cost isn't just yours to pay. Every girl who found her courage because of what I did also paid a price. Some lost their families. Some lost their homes, and one almost lost her life. This story starts in Portland, Oregon, where rain falls like whispered secrets, and my family's darkest tradition thrived in plain sight. Where American neighbors waved hello to us in the morning, completely unaware that the women in our household hadn't spoken a word to their husbands in years. Where silence was currency, and the quietest house on the block held the darkest secrets. I grew up knowing my 18th birthday would be the end of something. I just didn't know it would be the end of everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, about what it means to survive. They called it the quieting. We called it prison. And the ironic thing? The tool that would eventually free us was right there in my high school course catalog, listed between Mandarin and Spanish. A language designed to give voice to those who couldn't speak. A language that would become our rebellion, our resistance, our salvation, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it really started. To a 13-year-old girl who couldn't stop laughing, who sang in the shower, who talked too much in every class. A girl who had exactly 5 years before her voice would be taken away. A girl who was running out of time and didn't even know she needed to run. Growing up in our household was like living in 2 different worlds at the same time. During the day, my mother drove me to soccer practice, packed my lunches with notes that said, "Have a great day, sweetheart," in her careful handwriting, volunteered at my school's library. She talked to my teachers, laughed with other moms at pickup, ordered coffee with that particular Portland friendliness that makes everyone feel like neighbors. To the outside world, Rebecca Chen was just another suburban mom. Yoga pants and messy buns, reusable coffee cup and cloth grocery bags. Normal. Completely, utterly normal. But the moment we crossed our threshold, stepped through our front door and heard it click shut behind us, she became someone else entirely. Or rather, she became no one at all. Inside our house, my mother hadn't spoken to my father in 19 years. Not one word. Not even his name. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick, heavy, like fog that settled into every corner and never quite lifted. It had weight. It had presence. Sometimes I swear I could see it. This gray cloud that hung between my parents, between my aunts and uncles, between every married couple in our extended family. I didn't understand it when I was young. I thought all families worked this way. That all moms went quiet at home and talked outside. That all dads issued instructions without expecting responses. That all houses felt like libraries where someone had died. The first time I realized my family was different, I was 7 years old at my best friend Emma's house for dinner. Her mom was telling a story about something that happened at the grocery store, hands waving, voice rising with excitement. And then Emma's dad laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Tell them about the part with the melons." And Emma's mom did, grinning at him like they were in on some private joke together. I stared at them like they were speaking an alien language. Because in a way, they were. The language of partnership, of shared humor, of conversation between husband and wife. I'd never heard it before. When I asked my mom about it in the car, she tensed, hands tightening on the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. She didn't answer until we pulled into our driveway. Then she turned to me, cupped my face with both hands, and said something I would never forget. Emma's family is American, sweetheart. We're different. We keep our traditions. Her voice cracked on the last word. In our culture, when a girl becomes a woman, she learns the sacred art of listening, of being present without being heard. It's an honor. Even at 7, I knew that didn't sound like an honor. It sounded like a punishment for a crime I hadn't committed yet. The tradition had rules, of course. Everything in my family had rules. You could speak until your 18th birthday. Then came the ceremony, the quieting. Your father or oldest male relative would tie a red silk thread around your wrist in an elaborate ritual that took hours. Prayers in Mandarin that I couldn't understand. Incense that made your eyes water. All the women of the family standing in a circle around you, their own red threads glinting in the candlelight like warnings. Once the thread was tied, you were expected to never speak to any man in your family again. Not your husband, not your father, not your brothers or sons. You could speak to your daughters until they turned 18, and to other silenced women, but that was it. The men called it maintaining harmony. The women called it nothing because they weren't allowed to. But here's what nobody talked about. The real rules. The ones whispered between women when the men were watching football or working late. Break the silence rule once, and they'd lock you in the laundry room overnight. No food. No water. Just you and your shame and the smell of detergent that would forever remind you of failure. Break it twice, and they'd take you to a dentist who asked no questions. One of your back teeth would mysteriously need extraction. A permanent reminder that your voice had no value. Nobody broke it 3 times. At least, nobody I ever met. Though my mother once told me about a cousin who did, back in Taiwan. Her name was never spoken again. It was like she'd never existed. When I asked what happened to her, my mother just shook her head and looked away, but not before I saw the fear flash across her face. The men measured their status by the silence in their homes. At family gatherings, my uncles would literally compete. Uncle James would lean back in his chair, beer in hand, and announce that Victoria hasn't made a peep since February. He'd say it like he was bragging about a new car or a promotion at work. The other men would nod approvingly, offering congratulations like he'd accomplished something remarkable instead of something monstrous. Then Uncle David would top him. That's nothing. Crystal's going on 3 years. Doctor asked her about her symptoms at her last checkup, and she just pointed at me to answer. Even the doc was impressed. He'd grin like he'd won something, chest puffed out with pride. I remember watching these exchanges from my spot at the kids' table, my stomach churning with something I couldn't quite name yet. Later, I'd learned to call it rage. But back then, I just felt sick. Aunt Victoria was my favorite. She used to sneak me cookies before dinner when I was little, her eyes twinkling with mischief. She'd tickle me until I couldn't breathe from laughing. I still remembered her voice, musical and warm. And now it was gone. Erased. Treated like some kind of achievement. The women didn't compete. They couldn't. But they had their own quiet hierarchy. The longer you'd been silent, the more respect you received from other silenced women. They'd touch your red thread almost reverently, like it was a war medal instead of a shackle. New wives, freshly silenced and still adjusting, would look to the veterans for guidance. How do you navigate a marriage without words? How do you raise children when you can't speak to half of them? How do you survive? The answers came in gestures, in notes passed under tables, in a complex system of signals that the women had developed over decades. A finger to the temple meant headache. A hand on the heart meant sadness or love, depending on context. A sharp exhale meant frustration or anger or fear. You learned to read micro-expressions like they were billboards. The slightest tightening around the eyes, the way someone's shoulders dropped, the unconscious lean toward or away from their husband. Entire conversations happened in silence. Stories of abuse told through lingering bruises and long-sleeved shirts in summer. Cries for help communicated through desperate glances and trembling hands. Celebrations shared through smiles that never quite reached your eyes because how could they when your joy was incomplete, truncated, stolen? I was the loudest person in our family. Maybe because I knew what was coming. Maybe because I was rebelling before I even knew what rebellion meant. I couldn't stop talking. In class, my teachers constantly told me to raise my hand before speaking. At home, I narrated everything I did like I was hosting a TV show. And now Maya's going to brush her teeth. Watch as she squeezes the toothpaste with perfect precision. My dad would shush me constantly, but I couldn't help it. Words bubbled out of me like I had too many and needed to use them before they expired. I sang in the shower. Badly. Show tunes, mostly. Belting out Hamilton lyrics at the top of my lungs until the bathroom was full of steam and echoes. My mother would sometimes stand outside the door, and I swear I could hear her humming along, so quietly I might have imagined it. I laughed at everything. My friends joked that I made weird sounds when something was funny. Not just laughing, but these strange squeaks and snorts that should have been embarrassing, but somehow weren't. Laughter felt like rebellion, like proof I was still alive, still here, still me. But at 13, time was no longer infinite. 5 years until my 18th birthday. 5 years until the red thread. 5 years until silence. I started having nightmares. In them, I'd wake up and try to scream, but nothing would come out. My mouth would open, my throat would strain, but there was only silence. Thick and suffocating. I'd wake up gasping, actually screaming just to prove I still could. My dad would bang on my door and tell me to quiet down. The irony was never lost on me. That's when the anxiety started. Real, physical panic that would hit me at random moments. I'd be eating dinner or watching TV, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. My chest would tighten like someone was sitting on it. My hands would shake. My vision would tunnel. I felt like I was drowning in air, desperately trying to surface, but never quite making it. My parents took me to a doctor who said it was teenage hormones and stress. Prescribed deep breathing exercises and journaling. But how do you journal your way out of a future where you're not allowed to exist? How do you breathe deeply when you know you're counting down to the day your breath becomes the only sound you're allowed to make? I started watching my mother more carefully. Really watching. The way she'd freeze when my father entered a room, like a deer sensing danger. The way she'd nod at his questions, her face carefully blank. The way she'd sometimes start to speak and then stop, hand flying to her mouth like she'd almost committed a crime. The way her eyes always looked tired, like silence was exhausting work. I watched Aunt Victoria serve dinner with mechanical precision, never meeting Uncle James's eyes. I watched Aunt Crystal communicate with her daughters through elaborate pantomimes that would have been funny if they weren't heartbreaking. I watched my grandmother, who'd been silent for 45 years, move through rooms like a ghost, so used to being unheard that she'd forgotten how to take up space. And I made a decision. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to find a way out. Because I couldn't become them. I wouldn't. I'd rather run away, rather cut ties with everyone I knew. Rather be completely alone than spend the rest of my life as a mime in my own marriage, pantomiming my needs and swallowing my words until they poisoned me from the inside. I just needed to figure out how. And I needed to do it before I turned 18, before they tied that thread around my wrist and I became another statistic in a tradition that had destroyed every woman in my family for generations. Time was running out. I could almost hear it ticking. 5 years. 4 years and 11 months. 4 years and 10 months. Counting down to the day my voice would die. The answer came on a Tuesday morning in November, and it came from the most unexpected place. Mr. Henderson, my 8th grade English teacher, was explaining the foreign language requirement for high school. All students needed 2 years of a foreign language to graduate. The options were listed on the smartboard: Spanish, French, Mandarin, German, Japanese. And there, at the bottom of the list, in smaller font like an afterthought, American Sign Language. My heart stopped. Then it started racing so fast I thought everyone around me could hear it, pounding against my ribcage like it was trying to escape. Sign language. A language you spoke with your hands. A language that needed no voice at all. A language that had been created specifically for people who couldn't speak or couldn't hear. A language that my family couldn't police because they didn't know it existed. A language that could slip under their radar completely invisible. The more I thought about it, the more brilliant it became. The tradition only silenced our voices. It said nothing about our hands. The men in my family wouldn't see gestures as speech. They'd think we were just fidgeting, adjusting our hair, playing with our clothes. They wouldn't understand that we could have entire conversations right in front of them, that we could say everything they'd forbidden us to say without making a single sound. I went home that afternoon with a fire in my chest. For the first time since learning about the quieting, I felt something besides dread. I felt hope. Dangerous, electric hope that made my hands shake as I filled out the course selection form. But fear crept in quickly. What if my parents saw the form? What if they asked questions? My dad barely paid attention to my school stuff, but my mom reviewed everything. She'd see ASL on my schedule and immediately know what I was planning. She'd tell my father. They'd pull me out of school or switch me to homeschooling or send me back to Taiwan early. I couldn't let that happen. So I did something I'd never done before. I forged my mother's signature. My hand trembled as I copied her looping handwriting, the way she dotted her I's with little circles, the way her signature ended with a flourish. It looked almost perfect. Almost. But it would have to do. I turned in the form the next morning before I could chicken out. Dropped it in Mr. Henderson's box and walked away quickly, like I was fleeing a crime scene. Which, in a way, I was. In my family, planning for your own future was a crime. Having ideas of your own was a crime. Taking action without permission was the biggest crime of all. The weeks until freshman year started felt endless. Every day I expected a phone call to our house. Expected Mr. Henderson to realize the signature was forged. Expected my mother to somehow find out. I jumped every time the phone rang. Held my breath every time my parents looked at me too long. But the call never came. My secret held. On the first day of freshman year at Lincoln High School, I walked into Ms. Patricia Rodriguez's ASL classroom with my heart in my throat. The room was different from other classrooms. There was a carpet instead of tile, making it quieter. The desks were arranged in a U-shape so everyone could see everyone else. And on every wall, there were posters of hands forming letters, words, phrases. Ms. Rodriguez was young, maybe late 20s, with dark curly hair pulled back in a messy bun and bright red glasses that made her look both professional and approachable. She stood at the front of the room and didn't say a word. Just waited. The silence stretched, awkward and uncertain, as students shuffled in and found seats. Some kids whispered to each other, unsure if they were allowed to talk. When the bell rang, Ms. Rodriguez still didn't speak. Instead, she raised her hands and began signing. Her fingers moved with fluid grace, forming shapes and patterns that looked almost like dancing. None of us understood. We just stared, confused and a little uncomfortable. Then she smiled, walked to the board, wrote in large letters, "Welcome to your last speaking period. After today, this classroom is a voice-off zone." My classmates groaned. One kid asked if she was serious. Ms. Rodriguez just tapped the board and signed something else. Then she wrote the translation. "In this room, your voice is your hands. Let's learn to use them." I felt something shift in my chest. This was it. This was what I'd been searching for. We started with the basics. The manual alphabet. 26 letters formed by hands in different positions. A was a closed fist with the thumb up. B was an open palm with the thumb across. C was a curved hand like you were holding an invisible cup. I practiced obsessively, forming letters over and over until my hands ached. At home, I'd practice under my blanket with a flashlight. In the bathroom with the door locked. At the dinner table while people talked around me, my hands moving under the table where no one could see. I started spelling out my thoughts, giving them shape even if only I could understand them. Ms. Rodriguez taught us that ASL wasn't just English with hands. It was its own language with its own grammar, its own syntax, its own culture. She taught us about deaf culture, about a community that thrived without sound, about people who didn't see their deafness as a disability, but as a different way of existing in the world. I clung to every word. Because she was describing exactly what I needed. A way to exist outside the boundaries my family had set. A way to have a voice without making a sound. By winter break, I'd moved beyond the alphabet to actual words and phrases. Simple ones at first. Hello. Thank you. My name is. But every new sign felt like a key unlocking a door. I'd lie in bed at night, practicing in the dark, my hands forming words no one could hear, but everyone could see if only they knew how to look. The real test came during our family's holiday gathering. Every year, all the relatives who lived in the area would come to our house for a big dinner. It was supposed to be joyful, a celebration of family and tradition. But I'd started to see these gatherings differently. They weren't celebrations. They were displays. Showcases where the men paraded their silent wives like trophies. That year, my cousin Lily was there. She'd just turned 19, which meant she'd been silent for almost a year. I hadn't seen her since her quieting ceremony, and the change shocked me. The Lily I remembered was loud and confident, always cracking jokes, always the center of attention. This Lily was a shell. She moved quietly through rooms, eyes downcast, shoulders hunched like she was trying to take up less space. Her red thread stood out against her pale wrist, a bright slash of color that might as well have been a brand. During dinner, I watched her serve food to the men, refilling drinks without being asked, anticipating needs before they could voice them. It was like watching someone who'd been trained not as a wife, but as a servant. When one of the men made a crude joke about women knowing their place, the other men laughed. Lily's face stayed blank, but her hands trembled as she poured water, and a little splashed onto the table. Her husband snapped at her. Can't even pour water right. What do I even keep you around for? More laughter from the men. Lily's face flushed red, but she couldn't defend herself. Couldn't tell him to go to hell. Couldn't do anything but wipe up the spill and retreat to the kitchen where the other silent women waited like an audience for a tragedy they'd all lived through. I followed her. Found her in the corner by the sink, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The other women stood nearby, touching her gently, offering comfort in the only way they could. But their comfort was limited. They couldn't tell her it would get better. Couldn't promise her things would change. Because for them, nothing had changed. This was life. This was marriage. This was what being a woman in our family meant. Something in me cracked open. I'd been planning to teach only myself ASL, to keep it as a secret weapon for my own future. But looking at Lily, at all of them, I realized that wasn't enough. One person with a secret language was just a person with a secret. But a group of people with a secret language? That was power. I waited until the men were absorbed in watching a basketball game, their voices loud with competition and beer. Then I approached Lily and her younger sister, Sarah, who was only 15 and had 3 years before her own quieting. I handed Lily a napkin with a message written in tiny letters. Meet me outside by the garage. Bring Sarah. Tell no one. Lily's eyes widened. For a second, I thought she'd refuse. Thought the fear had hollowed her out too completely. But then she nodded, just barely, and I saw a spark of the old Lily flicker in her eyes. The Lily who'd climbed trees and broken rules and lived too loud for the space she was supposed to occupy. 10 minutes later, we stood in the dark garage among the smell of motor oil and old paint. My dad's tools hung on pegboards, organized with an obsessive precision that matched how he tried to organize our lives. But here, in this forgotten space, we were free for a moment. I showed them the alphabet first, made them practice forming each letter until they could do it without thinking. Sarah picked it up quickly, her young hands flexible and eager. Lily struggled more, her fingers stiff from disuse, from a year of clenching them to keep from speaking. But she kept trying, and watching her determination gave me courage. We practiced basic phrases: help, scared, angry, words they weren't allowed to say out loud. With each new sign, I could see something shifting in them. Lily stood a little straighter. Sarah smiled for the first time that evening. They were finding pieces of themselves they'd thought were lost. Why are you doing this? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, always aware that we could be overheard. I looked at both of them. Because in 3 years, they're going to try to silence me, and I'm going to fight back. but I can't do it alone. Understanding passed between us. This wasn't just about learning a new language. This was about survival, about resistance, about refusing to accept a future that had been decided for us by men who'd never had to live it themselves. We met in secret after that, whenever our families gathered. Sarah would tell her parents she needed help with homework. I'd volunteer to tutor her. We'd spend hours in my room or the local library, practicing signs and building a vocabulary of rebellion. Every finger-spelled word was an act of defiance. Every phrase we learned was another weapon in an arsenal we were slowly building. Eventually, Sarah brought another cousin. Then another. Word spread through whispered conversations and passed notes. Young girls who were approaching 18 and terrified. Slightly older women who'd been recently silenced and were desperate for any form of connection. Even some of the longer silent women started watching us, and though they couldn't join our secret sessions, I'd catch them practicing simple signs when their husbands weren't looking. By the time I turned 16, we had a network. 12 girls between the ages of 11 and 17, all fluent enough to have real conversations. We developed our own codes and signals. A specific way of touching your hair meant, danger, someone's coming. Tapping 3 times on any surface meant, change the subject. He's paying attention. We became fluent in 2 languages, the secret language of our hands and the secret language of survival. We called ourselves the Silent Sirens, because sirens sing to lead people to safety or to their doom, depending on the story. And we were leading ourselves to safety, even if it meant our family's doom. Everything changed the week before my 17th birthday. We were having another family dinner, and I'd already noticed something was off. The men were gathered in clusters, talking in low voices that stopped whenever one of us girls walked by. The women moved through the house with tight shoulders and worried glances. Something was happening, and they weren't telling us what. The announcement came after dessert. Uncle David stood up, clearing his throat importantly. He had that look men get when they're about to make a pronouncement they think everyone should care about. Next to him, Aunt Crystal kept her eyes fixed on her plate, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles were bone white. "We have happy news to share," Uncle David began, his chest puffed out like he was announcing a promotion. "Our Sophia is getting married." The room erupted in congratulations. The men clapped Uncle David on the back. The women smiled their careful, controlled smiles. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at Sophia, my 13-year-old cousin who is currently sitting at the kids' table looking like she might throw up. 13. She was 13 years old. I found out the details later through our secret network. The groom was 67-year-old Robert Chen, a distant cousin from our Taiwan family who'd specifically requested a young, pre-silenced bride. He ran a successful import business and could provide well, which apparently was all that mattered. The wedding was scheduled for 3 weeks away. They were rushing it because once Sophia turned 14, she'd be harder to train, according to the men's logic. Younger wives were easier to mold, easier to break, easier to silence before they'd fully learned to use their voice. Sophia's 11-year-old sister, Jessica, contacted me through our group chat that night. The messages came through rapid fire, misspelled in her panic. Hez mean, he hurts her. She has bruises. Maya, we need help. I stared at my phone screen, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type back. I'd heard rumors about Robert Chen. The women in Taiwan whispered about him, even though whispering was all they were allowed. 2 previous wives who'd both died young under suspicious circumstances. A temper that exploded at the slightest perceived disrespect. Hands that left marks hidden under long sleeves. And they were giving him Sophia. Sweet, funny Sophia who loved anime and wanted to be a marine biologist. Sophia who still had braces and stuffed animals on her bed. Sophia who was supposed to have a childhood, a future, a life. We held an emergency meeting in my garage. 8 of us crammed into the space, sitting on overturned buckets and the floor, our phones the only light. In the darkness, we signed to each other frantically, working through options. Run away. But where? We were minors. The police would bring us back. Tell someone at school. But would they believe us? Arranged marriages weren't technically illegal if both parties were willing. And how could we prove Sophia wasn't willing when she'd been trained her whole life to go along with what the men decided? Stop the wedding. But how? We were just kids. Powerless kids trying to stop a freight train with our bare hands. We have to do something, Sarah signed, her face fierce in the phone light. She'd been practicing more advanced ASL and could sign complex thoughts now. We can't let this happen. What can we do? Another cousin signed back. They're stronger. They make the rules. They always win. But Jessica, little 11-year-old Jessica, signed something that stopped us all. We have something they don't. What? I signed. Each other, she signed. They think we're alone, separated, easy to control. But we're not alone anymore. There's 12 of us. That has to count for something. She was right. For generations, the women in our family had been isolated, pitted against each other, taught that silence was individual strength rather than collective weakness. But we'd broken that pattern. We'd built connections they didn't know existed. We had a network, a community, a sisterhood of resistance. Okay, I signed. So we use that. We make a plan. Over the next 2 weeks, we gathered evidence. Jessica was our inside source, living in the same house as Sophia. She documented everything with her phone. Photos of bruises on Sophia's arms where Robert had playfully grabbed her too hard during a pre-wedding visit. Recordings of him making crude comments about what he planned to do once they were married. Screenshots of messages he'd sent that were clearly sexual in nature, sent to a 13-year-old child. Sarah researched laws on her school computer, printing out information about statutory rape, about forced marriage, about child protective services. We learned that forced marriage was actually illegal in Oregon as of 2021, that children under 18 couldn't legally consent to marriage without parental permission, but even with it, there were supposed to be safeguards. That what our family was doing was criminal, not traditional. That we had rights, even if they'd spent our whole lives teaching us we didn't. We practiced what we'd say, how we'd say it, who would speak first, how we'd support each other when the inevitable backlash came. Because there would be backlash. We weren't naive enough to think there wouldn't be consequences for standing up, for speaking out, for daring to say that something our elders decreed was actually wrong. The night before the wedding, I barely slept. I kept running through scenarios in my head. Best case, we stop the wedding. Sophia is safe. The family is angry but eventually understands. Worst case, we fail. Sophia is married off. We all face punishment and nothing changes. But doing nothing wasn't an option. I'd spent my whole life watching women be silenced, and I was done watching. One way or another, tomorrow was going to change everything. I just didn't realize how literally true that would be. How one moment of courage would set off a chain reaction that would eventually land 6 people in jail, break apart families that had stood together for 4 generations, and force every person in our community to choose a side. Tomorrow, the silent sirens would sing, and the whole world would hear us. The wedding was held at my grandfather's house in suburban Beaverton, a sprawling property he'd bought in the 80s when Portland was cheaper, and Asian families were just starting to establish their communities. The house sat on 2 acres, isolated from neighbors by tall hedges that kept secrets in as effectively as they kept strangers out. I arrived with my parents at noon, wearing the dress my mother had picked out for me. Red and gold, traditional, suffocating. The fabric scratched against my skin like a reminder of everything I was about to risk. My mother kept glancing at me during the drive, like she could sense something was wrong but couldn't pinpoint what. I kept my face carefully neutral, my hands folded in my lap so she wouldn't see them shaking. The house was already full of people. More than 200 guests packed into the main room and spilling into the backyard. Every branch of our extended family had shown up, some flying in from California, from New York, even some from Taiwan. A wedding was always a big deal, but this one was especially significant because it was the first wedding we'd had in Oregon in years. Most girls were sent back to Taiwan for their marriages, but Robert Chen had specifically requested an American wedding. I guess even traditional men liked the convenience of the U.S. legal system when it suited them, Sophia sat at the front of the room on a raised platform like a princess in a fairy tale. Except in fairy tales, the princess was happy. Sophia looked like she was attending her own funeral. Her wedding dress was elaborate, all red silk and gold embroidery, probably cost thousands of dollars. Money her father had spent to gift wrap his daughter for a predator. Her makeup was heavy, probably to cover how much she'd been crying. Her hands were folded in her lap, and I could see the slight tremor even from across the room. Robert Chen stood next to her, looking proud and possessive. At 67, he looked exactly like what he was. A creepy old man who couldn't find a woman his own age willing to deal with him. His hand kept finding Sophia's shoulder, squeezing, a gesture that looked affectionate to anyone who didn't know better. But I saw Sophia flinch every time he touched her. Saw the way she held her body rigid, like she was trying to disappear into herself. I found my position near the aisle. The other girls in our network were scattered throughout the crowd, placed strategically. We'd planned this like a military operation. Phase 1, gather evidence. Phase 2, coordinate timing. Phase 3, speak out. Phase 4, don't back down no matter what. Jessica was my main signal. She sat in the second row, close enough to Sophia to see everything. She'd been documenting all morning, her phone hidden in her purse, recording as Robert made inappropriate comments to Sophia about their wedding night. As older male relatives made jokes about breaking in a young wife. Evidence. All of it evidence. The ceremony began with traditional prayers, the same prayers that had been spoken at every wedding in our family for generations. Prayers about duty and obedience and harmony. Prayers that never mentioned love or choice or consent. The men's voices droned on in Mandarin, beautiful and empty. The women stood silent, their red threads like prison chains. I watched the officiator, an uncle from my grandfather's generation, begin the binding ritual. The red thread that would connect Sophia to Robert. But this wasn't the silence thread. Not yet. That came after marriage at 18. This was different, but somehow worse. This thread would bind her legally to a man who would then have 5 years to break her completely before stealing her voice entirely. That's when Jessica caught my eye. She made our signal. A hand to her throat, a specific gesture we'd practiced. It meant now. It meant the video was ready. It meant it was time to choose between safety and what was right. I stood up. The room was so quiet that the sound of me standing echoed. 200 faces turned to look at me. I could feel my father's glare burning into my back. My mother's sharp intake of breath. My grandfather rising from his seat at the front, his face already darkening with rage. But I looked at Sophia. Only at Sophia. And I spoke. This wedding can't happen. My voice cracked. Too loud in the sudden silence. Too clear. Undeniable. The room exploded. Sit down, my father hissed, reaching for my arm. How dare you? Uncle David shouted from the front. You have no right? She's 13 years old, I shouted over him, and the room went quiet again. Because we didn't talk about ages. We didn't acknowledge that the brides were children. We called them young women, as if that made it better. As if fancy words could disguise what this really was. She's a child being forced to marry a 67-year-old man who has already hurt her. Look at her arms. Look at the bruises he put there. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I have evidence. Photos, videos, messages. This isn't a marriage. This is abuse. And I won't sit here quietly and watch it happen. That's when the others stood. One by one, like dominoes falling in reverse. Sarah stood first, then 2 more cousins. Then Jessica. Brave little Jessica who had more courage at 11 than most adults ever find. Then 4 more. 8 girls standing in a sea of seated people, our voices joining together. We know what he did, Sarah said, her voice stronger than mine. We have proof. This is illegal, another cousin added. Forced marriage of minors is illegal in Oregon. We already called the police, Jessica said, and that's when I heard the sirens outside. The sound cut through the chaos like a knife. Everyone froze. Through the front windows, I could see the red and blue lights approaching. 2 police cars, a CPS van. Help was here. We'd actually done it. But before I could feel relief, my father grabbed my arm so hard I gasped. His grip was iron, his fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to leave marks. His face was inches from mine, twisted with rage I'd never seen before. "What have you done?" he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I looked him straight in the eye. "I saved her. That's what I've done." The police were at the door. The world was changing, and there was no going back. The police officers who entered my grandfather's house were a study in contrasts. Officer Martinez was young, maybe late 20s, with kind eyes that took in everything without judgment. Officer Kim was older, Korean-American, and I could see her code switching between professional cop and someone who understood exactly what kind of family dynamics she was walking into. Behind them came 2 CPS workers, both women, both carrying tablets and wearing expressions that said they'd seen worse, but this was still pretty damn bad. My grandfather moved forward immediately. His face transformed into a mask of confused hospitality. This was his gift. The ability to make terrible things look reasonable. To wrap abuse in the language of culture and tradition until outsiders couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "Officers, there must be some mistake," he said, his English suddenly perfect despite usually claiming he didn't speak it well. "We're just having a family celebration. A wedding. Surely someone has given you wrong information." Officer Kim wasn't buying it. "We received a report about a forced marriage of a minor. We need to speak with the bride." Her eyes found Sophia on the platform. "Privately." Of course," my grandfather said smoothly. "But I must inform you, in our culture, young women don't speak to strange men without family present. It would be inappropriate." "I'm not a strange man. I'm a police officer," Officer Martinez cut in. "And we're not asking for permission. This is a welfare check." The room had descended into a weird kind of controlled chaos. Guests were trying to leave but couldn't because the police cars were blocking the driveway. The men were clustered in groups, talking in urgent whispers, probably trying to figure out what to say, how to spin this. The women stood frozen, uncertain whether to stay silent as trained or to speak up for once. Uncle David pushed through the crowd. "You can't just come in here and disrupt a private family event. We have rights." "So does she," Officer Kim interrupted, nodding toward Sophia. "She's a minor, and we have reason to believe she's in danger. So unless you want to add obstruction to whatever else we might find here, I suggest you step back and let us do our job." One of the CPS workers approached Sophia gently, speaking in a low, calm voice. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw Sophia nod, saw her glance at Jessica, who gave her a tiny thumbs up. Permission, encouragement, a reminder that she didn't have to protect the people who'd never protected her. They took Sophia to my grandfather's study, closing the door behind them. Through the frosted glass, I could see silhouettes. The CPS worker sitting down. Sophia still standing, her posture defensive. Then slowly, gradually, her shoulders starting to shake. She was crying. Finally crying. Finally letting out everything she'd had to hold in. That's when Robert tried to leave. He edged toward the back door, trying to be casual about it, but Officer Martinez caught the movement. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay where you are." "I have business to attend to," Robert said, his voice smooth. "This doesn't concern me. The bride is having cold feet. It happens. I'll come back when she's ready." "The bride is 13 years old," Officer Martinez said flatly. "And according to the information we received, you've been in contact with her in ways that concern us. So you're not going anywhere until we sort this out." Robert's mask slipped. "She's my fiancée. Her parents approved. This is all legal." "No," Officer Kim interrupted. "It's not. Oregon law prohibits anyone under 17 from getting married. Period. So this wedding? Not legal. Whatever you thought you were doing here? Not legal. And if we find evidence that you've had inappropriate contact with a minor, you're looking at serious charges." The color drained from Robert's face. Around the room, other men were starting to look nervous. Because if the police were paying attention to this wedding, what else might they find? What other secrets might come tumbling out? My father hadn't let go of my arm. His grip had actually tightened, cutting off circulation, turning my fingers cold. "Do you see what you've done?" He whispered viciously. "You've brought shame on all of us. The police. In our home. Everyone will know." "Good," I whispered back. "Let them know. Let everyone know what you people do to your daughters." He raised his other hand like he might hit me, right there in front of everyone. But Officer Martinez was suddenly there, stepping between us. "Sir, I'm going to need you to let go of her arm. Now." My father released me slowly, reluctantly. I stumbled back, cradling my arm where his fingerprints were already darkening into bruises. Evidence. More evidence. "Are you okay?" Officer Martinez asked me quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Because I wasn't okay. None of us were okay. But we were alive and we were fighting, and for now, that had to be enough. The study door opened. Sophia came out with the CPS worker, her face red and swollen from crying. The worker's expression was grim. "We're taking her into protective custody. We have reason to believe she's in imminent danger." Uncle David exploded. "You can't do that. She's our daughter. And you were trying to marry her off to a man 50 years older than her." The CPS worker shot back. "So yes, we absolutely can do that. She's coming with us, and someone from our office will be in contact about an investigation." Aunt Crystal made a sound then. Not words, because she wasn't allowed words, but a sound. A cry. A mother's anguish breaking through decades of enforced silence. She reached for Sophia, her hands outstretched, her red thread glinting in the light. Sophia hesitated. Then she ran to her mother, collapsing into her arms. They held each other, both crying, and for a moment the room was completely still. Even the men didn't dare interrupt that moment. That raw, painful, necessary goodbye. The CPS worker gave them a minute, then gently separated them. "We'll arrange supervised visits, but right now we need to get her somewhere safe." As they led Sophia out, she turned and looked at all of us. At me, at Jessica, at Sarah and the other girls who'd stood up with me. Her lips moved, and though no sound came out, I could read the words. "Thank you." Jessica ran after them, trying to follow her sister. Uncle David grabbed her by her hair, yanking her back hard enough that she screamed. And that's when everything really fell apart. Officer Martinez moved so fast I barely saw it. He had Uncle David's arm twisted behind his back in seconds. "That's assault. Witnessed assault of a minor. You're under arrest." "For disciplining my own child?" Uncle David sputtered. "This is ridiculous. This is our culture. You can't—" "I can and I am," Officer Martinez said, pulling out handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The right to remain silent. In a family that had weaponized silence for generations, the one-time silence was actually a right. Nobody wanted it. The police didn't leave for 3 hours. They interviewed people separately, took statements, photographed bruises. Mine weren't the only ones. When Officer Kim asked the women if they'd been hurt, most stayed silent out of habit. But Jessica showed her bruises. Sarah showed hers. Even a few of the adult women slowly, hesitantly, revealed marks hidden under long sleeves and high collars. They arrested 3 men that day. Uncle David for the assault on Jessica. Robert Chen for attempted statutory rape and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. And my Uncle James for trying to bribe an officer, offering money if they'd just forget about this whole misunderstanding. As the police led them out in handcuffs, the divide in the room became visible. Some family members looked horrified at what was happening. Others looked horrified at us. At me. At the girls who'd spoken up. At the women who'd finally shown their wounds. My grandfather stood in the center of it all, aged suddenly. Like watching the arrests had taken years off his life instead of minutes. His authority, so absolute for so long, had crumbled in the face of actual authority. Police trumped patriarchy. Law trumped tradition. And he didn't know how to exist in a world where his word wasn't final. When the police finally left, promising they'd be back for follow-up investigations, the real chaos began. Families started fighting. Years of resentment poured out in Chinese and English, old grievances mixing with new ones. Some blamed me. Some blamed the girls who'd stood with me. Some blamed the women who'd shown their bruises. It was everyone's fault except the men who'd created the system in the first place. My mother pulled me aside into the kitchen. Her hands were shaking as she gripped my shoulders. For a long moment, she just stared at me, and I couldn't read her expression. Anger? Fear? Disappointment? Then she hugged me. Hard. Desperately. Like I might disappear if she let go. "I'm sorry," she whispered into my hair. "I'm so sorry. I should have done this. Years ago. I should have stopped this. But I was too afraid." I hugged her back, tears streaming down my face. "Mom, No." She pulled back, looking me in the eyes. Her own eyes were red, full of tears she'd held in for 19 years. "You were so brave. You saved that little girl. You did what I couldn't do. What none of us could do." "What's going to happen now?" I asked. She looked toward the living room where my father stood with the other men, their faces dark with anger and humiliation. "I don't know, but things can't go back to how they were. Not after this." She was right. The police investigation would go on for months. CPS would be involved. People would have to choose sides. And our family, already cracked, was about to shatter completely. My father drove us home in silence. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but dangerous, like the quiet before a tornado. My mother sat in the front seat, her hands folded in her lap, her red thread visible against her skin. I sat in the back, waiting. When we got home, he finally spoke. "Go to your room." "Dad, Now." His voice was flat, cold, scarier than if he'd yelled. I went. Heard them arguing downstairs, my father's voice rising and falling, my mother staying calm but firm. I pressed my ear to the heating vent, trying to make out words. Embarrassed me in front of the entire family. She did the right thing. Police in my father's house. A 13-year-old child. Not how we do things. Maybe it's time we did things differently. That last voice was my mother's, and it was the bravest thing I'd ever heard. My phone buzzed constantly. Messages from the girls in our network, from cousins I hadn't talked to in years, from people I didn't even know were part of the extended family. Some were supportive. Most were angry. A few were threatening. "You destroyed our family. Traitor. You'll pay for this." But also, "Thank you for being brave. I wish someone had done this for me. You saved her life," Sarah texted. "My dad won't stop yelling. He says we're going back to Taiwan next week." Jessica. "They put Sophia in a foster home. She's okay. She's safe." Then messages from cousins I didn't expect. "Can you teach me sign language too?" The network was growing. Even through the chaos, even through the anger and fear, it was growing. Because we'd proven something today. We'd proven that we didn't have to accept what had always been. That tradition wasn't an excuse for abuse. That silence didn't have to be permanent. I fell asleep that night with my door locked from the inside, a chair propped under the handle, my phone in my hand. Not sure if I'd be here in the morning. Not sure if my father would send me away, lock me up, do something worse. But knowing that whatever happened, I'd spoken up. We'd spoken up. And 13-year-old Sophia was safe tonight because of it. That had to count for something. That had to be worth the price we were about to pay. The next day, 2 CPS workers showed up at our house at 8 a.m. My mother answered the door, still in her bathrobe, her hair wet from the shower. She looked at them and just nodded, like she'd been expecting this. Like she'd spent all night waiting for the knock on the door. They wanted to interview me. Alone. My father objected immediately, talking about parental rights and cultural differences and misunderstandings. But the CPS workers were firm. This was protocol. They'd received multiple reports. They needed to speak with all minors in the household separately. We sat in the living room, me on one couch, the two workers on the other. The woman introduced herself as Helen, the man as David. Helen had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. David had a notepad and a calm, professional manner that reminded me of a therapist. "You're not in trouble," Helen started. "We just want to understand what happened yesterday. Can you tell us, in your own words, what led to you calling the police?" So I told them everything. About the quieting ceremony, about the red threads, about how women in my family lost their voices at 18, about Sophia and Robert Chen and the bruises, about the network of girls learning sign language, about how we'd been planning this for weeks because we couldn't let another girl be sacrificed to a tradition that destroyed women. I showed them my phone, the photos Jessica had sent, the videos, the evidence we'd compiled. Helen and David looked at each other, something passing between them. Concern, maybe anger, definitely determination. "Maya," David said carefully, "are there other girls in your family facing similar situations? Are there other planned marriages?" I thought about lying, about protecting the family even after everything. But then I thought about Sophia's face at that wedding, about my mother's 19 years of silence, about Lily serving water with shaking hands while her husband mocked her. "Yes," I said. "There are 3 other girls whose parents have already started negotiations for marriages. 2 are 15, 1 is 14. Helen wrote something down. "Can you give us their names?" I hesitated, because giving names meant more investigations, more police, more families torn apart, more girls who might blame me for the chaos that followed. But it also meant more girls who might be saved. I gave them the names. Over the next week, CPS visited 6 different households in our extended family. The investigation expanded like ripples in water, touching everyone. They interviewed girls. They interviewed mothers, asking them to speak without their husbands present. Some women couldn't do it, so programmed into silence that even when given permission, the words wouldn't come. But others found their voices, and once they started talking, they couldn't stop. Stories poured out. Decades of abuse. Women who'd been hit for speaking. Girls who'd had teeth pulled as punishment. Forced marriages. Isolation. Control so complete it had become invisible. Just part of the fabric of family life. The community exploded. Half the families went into defensive mode, circling the wagons, claiming this was all a misunderstanding. Religious persecution. Cultural discrimination. They hired lawyers who used words like traditional practices and family autonomy to dress up abuse in fancy language. The other half quietly started changing. Some families left the community entirely, moving to different neighborhoods where they could rebuild without the weight of tradition crushing them. Some women removed their red threads and started speaking to their husbands for the first time in decades. Those conversations were messy, painful, full of years of unsaid things finally getting air. My parents' marriage teetered on the edge. My father moved into the guest room. My mother started going to therapy. They'd have these hushed, intense conversations late at night that would end with one or both of them crying. Sometimes I'd hear my mother's voice rising, saying things she'd never been allowed to say. Anger, resentment, pain. My father mostly listened, and maybe that was the first step toward something better. Or maybe it was just the beginning of the end. School became complicated. Half my friends' parents wouldn't let them hang out with me anymore. I was a troublemaker, a family destroyer, the girl who'd brought shame on the entire Chinese community. Never mind that I'd stopped a child from being married to a predator. That part didn't seem to matter to them, but I made new friends. Girls who'd heard about what happened and wanted to know more. Some had their own family secrets, their own traditions that hurt. We'd sit at lunch and compare notes on surviving families that loved you but also tried to break you. It was its own kind of support group. Ms. Rodriguez, my ASL teacher, pulled me aside one day after class. "I heard what happened," she said quietly. "What you did. Using ASL to help your cousins." I nodded, not sure where this was going. Was I in trouble for using her class as a cover? That's exactly what language is for, she continued. Communication, connection, freedom. You understood that better than most adults ever will. I'm proud of you. Those 4 words, I'm proud of you, hit me harder than I expected. I burst into tears right there in the classroom, and she just handed me tissues and let me cry. No judgment, no expectations, just space to fall apart. The girls in our network kept meeting. We'd gather at different houses, whoever's parents were cool with it. We practiced ASL not because we needed it for survival anymore. The secret was out. But because it was ours. Our language. Our bond. The thing that had saved us. New girls kept joining. Word spread through schools, through community centers, through whispered conversations. Girls with strict parents. Girls from other cultural backgrounds dealing with their own oppressive traditions. Girls who just needed to know they weren't alone. Our network grew from 12 to 20 to 35. We became something bigger than ourselves. We even got media attention. Local news wanted to do a story about the child marriage ring that had been broken up. My family freaked out, begged me not to talk to reporters, said it would make things worse. And maybe they were right. Maybe putting our family's darkness on display would just create more pain. But maybe people needed to know. Maybe other families with similar traditions needed to see that change was possible. That girls could fight back. That silence didn't have to be forever. I compromised. I agreed to an interview, but only if my face wasn't shown and my name wasn't used. They called me Maya C. and filmed me in silhouette. I told our story. About the quieting. About Sophia. About how a high school language class had become an underground railroad for girls escaping forced silence. The interview aired on a Thursday evening. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times online. Girls from all over the country reached out. Some were facing forced marriages. Some dealt with other traditions that controlled their bodies, their voices, their futures. All of them wanted to know. How did you fight back? How did you survive? I didn't have all the answers, but I told them what I'd learned. Find your people. Build your network. Document everything. Know that you have rights, even when your family tells you otherwise. And most importantly, your voice matters. Use it. My grandfather called an emergency family meeting 3 weeks after Sophia's failed wedding. He demanded that everyone attend. No excuses. The message read, "This family needs to come together and address the poison that has infected us." The poison. He meant me. He meant the girls who'd stood with me. He meant change itself. My parents fought about whether to go. My father insisted we had to. Family unity, respect for elders, all the usual arguments. My mother said she wasn't sure she wanted to be part of a family that valued tradition over children's safety. It was the first time I'd heard her openly question whether our family was worth saving. In the end, we went. But my mother made my father promise that if things got dangerous, we'd leave immediately. No matter what my grandfather said, no matter what it cost us socially. The meeting was at my grandfather's house again, the same place where everything had fallen apart. Walking in felt surreal. The room where Sophia should have been married was now just a room. The platform was gone. The decorations were gone. But the memory hung in the air like smoke you couldn't clear. About 70 people showed up, less than half the usual family gathering. The others had already made their choice. They weren't coming back. Some had moved out of state. Some had cut ties completely. The family was hemorrhaging members, and the ones who remained were either true believers or too afraid to leave. My grandfather stood at the front of the room looking older than I'd ever seen him. The arrests, the investigation, the public shame. It had all aged him decades, but his voice was still strong, still commanding. Our family stands at a crossroads. He began in Mandarin, my mother translating quietly for me. We can continue down the path of destruction that some among us have chosen, or we can return to the traditions that have sustained us for generations. He talked about honor and respect, about how Western values were corrupting our youth, about how the police investigation was an attack on our culture. He never once mentioned that a 13-year-old had almost been married to a predator. Never mentioned the abuse. Never mentioned that our traditions had hurt people. When he finished, he opened the floor for discussion. The men spoke first, as always. They agreed with my grandfather, called for a return to the old ways, suggested that families who'd abandoned the traditions should be officially shunned. Uncle David, out on bail and awaiting trial, stood up. We need to be firmer in our discipline. These girls have gotten out of control because we've been too soft. In Taiwan, this never would have happened. In Taiwan, my mother said suddenly, her voice cutting through the room. Girls are killing themselves rather than submit to these traditions. Is that what you want? Dead daughters? The room went silent. My mother had spoken, interrupted, contradicted a man. All things that should have been impossible. But she was done being impossible. She was done being silent. She stood up, pulling off her red thread and letting it fall to the floor. I've worn this for 19 years. 19 years of silence. 19 years of watching my daughter grow up knowing that her voice would be taken away. And for what? To preserve a tradition that was invented by men who wanted control? No more. Other women started standing. Some were women who'd been silent for decades, finding their voices for the first time. Others were younger women, refusing to be silenced in the first place. They didn't all remove their threads, but they all stood. A silent show of solidarity. Sit down, my grandfather commanded. All of you, this is not your place to speak. Then whose place is it? My mother challenged. Only yours? Only the men's? What kind of family only listens to half its members? The meeting dissolved into chaos. Families were literally screaming at each other. The men were furious at the women's rebellion. The women were furious at years of suppressed anger finally finding release. Some families walked out together. Others split, with wives leaving while husbands stayed. My father sat frozen through all of it, looking between my mother and his father, torn between the two. When my mother headed for the door, he didn't follow immediately. She turned back. "Kevin," she said quietly. "Are you coming?" He looked at his father, at his brothers, at the men who'd shaped his entire worldview. Then he looked at my mother, at me, at the family he'd created versus the family he'd been born into. He stood up, walked to my mother's side. My grandfather's face went purple with rage. "If you leave now, you're choosing them over your family, over me." "No," my father said. "I'm choosing my wife and my daughter. They are my family, and I should have chosen them a long time ago." We walked out together. 17 other families followed us. The split was official, permanent. Our family, which had stood together for 4 generations, had broken in half. In the parking lot, women were crying. Men were on their phones, trying to process what had just happened. Some families were already regretting their choice, wanting to go back, to apologize, to fix things. Others looked relieved, like they'd finally been given permission to leave a prison they'd been trapped in their whole lives. My mother hugged me tight. My father stood a little apart, still processing, but he'd made his choice. We'd made our choice. And there was no going back. The weeks following the split were some of the strangest of my life. My mother threw herself into learning how to be loud. She started singing in the shower again, belting out off-key versions of Taylor Swift songs that made me laugh and cry at the same time. She'd go to the grocery store and have long conversations with cashiers about absolutely nothing, just reveling in the ability to speak freely. She got a job at a local bookstore, something she'd always wanted to do but never could because my father said working outside the home was shameful. Her first paycheck, she framed it, hung it on the wall like it was a diploma. In a way, it was. Proof that she existed outside her role as silent wife. My father struggled more. He'd lost his job because his boss was one of the traditional uncles, lost most of his friends. His father wasn't speaking to him. His brothers had cut him off. He'd gone from the center of a large, tight-knit family to basically being alone except for us. Some days, I could see him regretting his choice, wondering if standing with us had been worth the cost. But then he'd see my mother laugh, really laugh, and something would shift in his face. Like he was seeing her for the first time as a whole person instead of a role she was supposed to fill. They were basically dating again. My parents. Getting to know each other. Learning how to have a marriage instead of just an arrangement. The other families who'd split off started forming their own community. We'd have gatherings, but different ones. Women talking as much as men. Kids running around making noise. Laughter that wasn't polite or controlled, but genuine and messy and real. It wasn't perfect. Decades of programming don't disappear overnight. But it was different. Better. But the traditional families didn't just disappear. They regrouped. Doubled down. Decided that if they were going to preserve their way of life, they needed to be more strict, not less. Some families sent their daughters back to Taiwan immediately, not waiting until 18. Better to lose them now than risk them being corrupted further. Sarah texted me one night. They're sending me away. Saturday morning, flight to Taipei. I won't be able to come back. I stared at the message, my heart sinking. Sarah was only 16. She had 2 years of high school left. Friends. A life. And they were shipping her off to a country she barely knew, to relatives who'd enforced the old rules even more strictly than her parents had. We have to stop them, I texted back. How? They're my parents. They can do whatever they want. But that wasn't quite true. I'd learned enough from the CPS investigation to know that parents couldn't just send their kids out of the country to avoid legal issues. And Sarah's parents had been part of the wedding situation. They were on CPS's radar. I called Helen, the CPS worker who'd interviewed me, told her what was happening. She said she'd look into it, but these things took time. Time we didn't have. Sarah's flight was in 4 days. That's when my mother surprised me. She can stay here, she said simply when I told her about Sarah. Tell her to pack a bag and come here. We'll figure out the legal stuff after. Won't that cause more problems? My mother shrugged. Probably, but what's the alternative? Let them send her away? We've already burned the bridges. Might as well make it worth it. So Sarah came to live with us. Then Jessica, whose father was in jail and whose mother was having a breakdown. Then 2 more cousins whose homes had become dangerous after the split. Our house became a refuge for girls escaping the traditional family's crackdown. We had 5 teenage girls sleeping in our living room and spare rooms. My mother loved it. She'd make huge breakfasts and pack lunches and help with homework and basically become the mother she'd never been allowed to be. The chaos drove my father crazy at first, but even he started to adapt. He'd help girls with math homework or fix their bikes or do all the dad things he'd been too distant to do before. The traditional families tried everything to get the girls back. Showed up at our door demanding their daughters. Called the police claiming kidnapping. Threatened lawsuits. But CPS had opened cases on all these families. The courts got involved. And slowly, legally, the girls stayed with us. The network kept growing. We formalized it, creating an actual organization. Voices Rising, we called it. We got a lawyer who worked pro bono to help girls in our situation. We partnered with domestic violence organizations. We created resources in multiple languages for girls dealing with oppressive family traditions. Ms. Rodriguez helped us set up ASL classes for survivors, teaching them the language that had saved us. Some women who'd been silenced for decades came to learn. They'd sit in those classes, fingers forming letters for the first time, tears streaming down their faces. Learning to communicate in a new way was helping them find their voices in every way. But success brought backlash. The traditional families started organizing against us. They created their own network, sharing information on how to avoid CPS, how to hide the traditions from outsiders, how to send girls overseas before they could be corrupted. They called us traitors, said we were destroying Asian culture, that we were tools of Western imperialism trying to erase traditional values. Some of the attacks got personal. My social media was flooded with hate messages, death threats, promises that I'd pay for what I'd done. Someone spray-painted traitor on our garage door, slashed our tires. My mother installed security cameras and taught me to watch my back. The worst was the day someone posted my school schedule online, along with photos of me and detailed information about my daily routine. The message was clear. We know where you are. We can get to you. The school had to get involved. I got a security escort between classes. My parents considered pulling me out, homeschooling me for safety. But I refused, because hiding felt like losing, like letting them win. I'm not going to be silent, I told my parents. That's what they want. That's what they've always wanted. For us to shut up and disappear. I'm done with that. My mother understood. My father looked terrified but nodded. They hired a lawyer to help us get a restraining order against specific family members who'd made direct threats. We documented everything, just like we'd taught the girls in our network to do. The fight wasn't over. In some ways, it was just beginning. The real turning point came 6 months after Sophia's failed wedding. Robert Chen's trial was scheduled, and the prosecution wanted me to testify. Wanted me to explain the family structure, the tradition of silence, why 13-year-old Sophia couldn't have been a willing bride in any meaningful sense. I was terrified. Testifying meant facing Robert Chen in court. Meant facing my grandfather and uncles and all the traditional family members who'd show up to support him. Meant putting everything on public record, making it official, permanent. But it also meant justice. Real, legal justice. Not just our small rebellion, but actual consequences for what these men had done. The night before I was supposed to testify, my grandmother called. My grandmother who'd been silent for 45 years, who'd removed her thread at that disastrous family meeting but hadn't spoken much since, like her voice was a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. "Maya," she said, her voice still raspy but clear. "I want to come with you tomorrow, to the courthouse. I want to testify too." I was shocked. "Grandma, you don't have to do that. I know it's hard for you." "Hard?" She laughed, a sound I'd never heard before. "Child, I've been silent for 45 years. Speaking in court for one day is the easiest thing I've ever done. Besides, someone needs to tell them where this tradition came from, who started it, and why it needs to end." She showed up the next morning in a red dress. Bright, bold, impossible to ignore red. The color of the threads we'd all been wearing. But this time, the color meant something different. Not silence, not submission, but strength. Courage, a refusal to disappear. The courthouse was packed. The traditional family had shown up in force, filling one side of the gallery. My mother, the girls from our network, and families who'd split off filled the other side. The divide was physical, visible. You could draw a line down the middle of the courtroom and know exactly where everyone stood. I testified first. The prosecutor asked me to explain the quieting tradition, to describe what life was like for women in our family, to explain why a 13-year-old marrying a 67-year-old was never just a cultural difference, but was abuse dressed up in traditional clothing. I told them everything, about the ceremonies, the red threads, the punishment for speaking, the competition between men over who had the quietest house, how women were literally trained not to exist in any meaningful way. Robert Chen's lawyer tried to discredit me, said I was too young to understand cultural nuance, that I was rebelling against my parents and inventing things, that this was all exaggeration from a dramatic teenager. That's when my grandmother stood up in the gallery. "That girl is telling the truth," she said loudly, every word of it. The judge looked surprised but gestured for her to come forward. "Ma'am, if you have testimony to offer, you can be sworn in." And she was. My 87-year-old grandmother took the stand and told her story, about being silenced at 18, about 45 years of voicelessness, about watching her daughters be silenced, her granddaughters facing the same fate, about how she'd stayed quiet even when she knew it was wrong because she was too afraid to be the first to break the cycle. "But these girls," she said, gesturing to where I sat, "they weren't afraid. Or maybe they were afraid but did it anyway. And they saved us all. Saved us from ourselves." She talked about the tradition's origins, how it had started with one controlling man who wanted his wives silent, how it had spread because other men saw the power in it, how it had been justified with religion and culture, But at its core, it was always about control. About making sure women couldn't question, couldn't object, couldn't leave. "This man," she said, pointing at Robert Chen, "wanted to marry a child. Not because of tradition, not because of culture, but because he wanted someone he could completely dominate. Someone whose voice he could take before she even learned to use it properly. That's not tradition. That's predatory behavior. And calling it tradition doesn't make it any better." The traditional family members started murmuring, getting restless. My grandfather stood up, trying to speak. The judge gavelled him down. "Sir, you'll have your chance if you're called to testify. Until then, remain seated and silent." The irony of a man being told to be silent in a case about silencing women wasn't lost on anyone. The trial lasted 3 days. Witness after witness testified. The CPS workers who'd investigated our family, Sophia, testifying via video link from her foster home, other girls who'd been in similar situations. Even my mother took the stand, describing her 19 years of enforced silence. The defense tried to argue cultural relativism, that Americans couldn't judge other cultures by American standards, that what seemed wrong to us was normal in their community, that forcing Western values on traditional families was its own form of oppression. The prosecutor shut that down hard. There is no culture that grants men the right to marry children. There is no tradition that makes abuse acceptable. And there is no version of respect for diversity that requires us to look away while girls are hurt. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, Robert Chen was found guilty on 3 counts: attempted statutory rape, attempted forced marriage of a minor, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. He was sentenced to 15 years. In the gallery, reactions split exactly as you'd expect. The traditional families looked devastated. The families who'd split off looked relieved. Some people cried. Some people cheered. My grandmother just nodded, like this was exactly the justice she'd been waiting 45 years to see. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. My grandmother agreed to an interview, her first ever. She stood in her bright red dress and told the world what she'd never been allowed to tell her own family. No tradition is worth your daughter's voice. No culture is worth your daughter's safety. And any man who thinks otherwise doesn't deserve the title of father. The interview went viral. Overnight, my grandmother became the face of our movement. The woman who'd survived 45 years of silence and come out the other side still fighting, still speaking, still refusing to let the next generation suffer what she had. After the trial, everything accelerated. The guilty verdict made national news. Suddenly, people were paying attention to traditions like ours that existed in plain sight, but nobody talked about. Other families, other cultures started reaching out. Stories of girls facing forced marriages, honor violence, female genital mutilation, other traditions that hurt women in the name of culture. Our small organization, Voices Rising, couldn't handle the volume of requests for help. So we expanded, hired staff, got grant funding, opened an actual office in downtown Portland. We partnered with existing organizations that worked with immigrant communities, with domestic violence survivors, with youth in crisis. I became the face of it, along with my grandmother. We did interviews, gave talks at schools and community centers, trained social workers and teachers on recognizing signs of girls in danger from cultural practices. It was exhausting and exhilarating and terrifying all at once. The traditional families in our community didn't disappear, but they went underground. The quieting ceremonies stopped happening openly. Some families claimed they'd abandoned the tradition entirely, though I suspected many just practiced it more secretly. Others genuinely changed, especially as daughters refused to participate or sons started questioning their fathers. My Uncle James, the one who'd bragged about his wife's silence, had a change of heart after spending 30 days in jail for assault. When he got out, he sat down with Aunt Victoria and asked her to speak to him. Really speak. Tell him everything she'd thought and felt during their marriage. She did. For 6 hours straight. Years of accumulated thoughts and feelings and pain poured out. He listened to all of it, and by the end, he was crying. They separated eventually. Too much damage to repair. but they did it with respect, with communication, with her voice finally mattering. Not all the stories had happy endings. Some families doubled down, moving to communities where the old traditions were still practiced without question. Some girls were sent overseas permanently. We couldn't save everyone. That reality haunted me on my bad days. But we saved some. That had to be enough. Sophia was thriving. She'd been placed with a progressive aunt and uncle who'd supported us from the beginning. She was in therapy, processing the trauma, but she was also just being a teenager. Going to high school, hanging out with friends, thinking about college, all the normal things she never would have had if we hadn't stopped that wedding. She came to one of our Voices Rising events, a gathering of survivors and supporters. She stood up in front of 100 people and told her story. Talked about the fear, the helplessness, the moment she realized she wasn't alone. The moment the police arrived and she knew she was going to be okay. "Maya saved my life," she said, looking right at me. But more than that, she showed me that my life was worth saving, that I wasn't just a piece of property to be traded between men, that my voice mattered. And now I'm here to help other girls realize the same thing. She became one of our youth advocates, working with girls facing similar situations. Jessica did too. Sarah. Even Lily, who'd been silent for a year before we broke the tradition. They all found ways to turn their pain into purpose. My parents were still figuring things out. My father had started therapy, working through the programming of his childhood, learning to question things he'd always accepted. It was slow, messy work. He backslid sometimes, falling into old patterns, but he kept trying. My mother bloomed. There's no other word for it. She took classes at community college, started a book club, made friends who'd never known her as the silent wife, who only knew her as Rebecca, fully voiced and fully alive. She and my father renewed their vows on their 20th anniversary, but this time she wrote her own vows, spoke them clearly, promised partnership, not obedience. I graduated high school with honors and got accepted to several colleges. I chose Portland State so I could stay close and keep working with Voices Rising. Ms. Rodriguez came to my graduation, hugged me tight, and told me she'd always known I'd do something important with the language she'd taught me. "You took a language created for accessibility and turned it into a language of revolution," she said. "That's beautiful." The traditional families eventually stopped actively trying to hurt us, though the divide never fully healed. Family gatherings became awkward affairs where some people showed up and others didn't. We'd see each other at funerals or weddings and nod politely, but the closeness was gone. Shattered like glass. And you can't unshatter glass. My grandfather passed away 2 years after the trial. At his funeral, the split was visible. Some family members eulogized him as a pillar of tradition, a man who'd held firm to his values. Others stayed silent, unable to praise a man who'd caused so much pain even if he was family. My grandmother gave the final eulogy. She talked about him honestly, his strengths and his failures, the good he'd done and the harm. She said she'd loved him once but had stopped being able to love someone who wouldn't let her exist fully. She said she hoped he'd found peace, but she'd found something better. Freedom. At the reception after, I watched the next generation of our family. Little kids running around, making noise, being loud and messy and fully themselves. Little girls who'd grow up never knowing what the quieting was except as a scary story about the past. Little boys who'd grow up learning that girls' voices were just as important as their own. That's what we'd fought for. Not revenge, not destruction. Just the radical idea that women and girls deserve to speak, to be heard, to exist without permission. College brought new challenges and new opportunities. I majored in social work with a minor in linguistics, wanting to combine my passion for helping people with my love of language. All languages, especially the ones that set people free. I continued running Voices Rising, though now we had a full staff and I was more like a founder emeritus than day-to-day manager. We'd helped over 300 girls escape harmful traditional practices, set up a scholarship fund for girls from strict families to go to college, created a legal defense fund for women facing honor violence. The work expanded beyond just our community. We were getting requests from all over the country, From girls in different cultural contexts facing different traditions, but the same core problem: families that valued control over their daughters' well-being. One day, I got an email that stopped me cold. It was from Taiwan, from a girl named Lynn who'd heard about our work through social media. Her family was planning to silence her on her 18th birthday, and she was desperate for help. Could we do anything? Could we save her like we'd saved Sophia? I stared at that email for hours, because the honest answer was, I don't know. Taiwan had different laws, different cultural contexts, different resources. We were a small Portland-based organization. How could we help someone halfway across the world? But then I thought about all the women in Taiwan who'd been silenced, all the girls facing the same future I'd almost faced, all the voices that had been stolen because no one had stood up and said enough. We started building an international network, connected with organizations in Asia that worked on women's rights, on domestic violence, on cultural practices that harmed women. Started developing resources that could be translated and adapted for different contexts. The work was slow and complicated, but it was necessary. Lynn eventually escaped her situation, made it to university in Taipei where she connected with activists, started her own small group fighting against silencing traditions. She'd email me updates, and I'd be struck by how similar our struggles were despite the distance. Same fight, different battleground. I dated in college. Nothing serious at first, just casual relationships while I figured out who I was outside the trauma of my family history. But in my junior year, I met Alex. They were non-binary, studying gender studies, full of ideas about dismantling patriarchy and reimagining what family could look like. We'd have these long conversations about tradition versus harm, about whether there was anything worth saving in cultures that hurt people, about how to honor heritage while refusing to repeat its mistakes. They got it in a way most people didn't. Understood that my family situation was complicated. Not just bad people doing bad things, but good people trapped in bad systems. My parents met Alex and handled it surprisingly well. My father struggled with the pronouns at first, but made a genuine effort. My mother loved them immediately, charmed by their enthusiasm and their kindness. They're good for you, she told me after their first visit. They make you laugh. She was right. Alex did make me laugh. Made me remember that life could be light sometimes, not always heavy with the weight of other people's pain. We talked about the future carefully, knowing that my past made commitment complicated. But we built something real, something based on choice and communication and respect. The other girls from our original network stayed close. We'd have reunions where we'd sign to each other, half out of nostalgia and half because ASL was still our secret language, the language of our resistance. We'd update each other on our lives, celebrate victories, support each other through setbacks. Sarah was studying law, planning to specialize in family law and immigrant rights. Jessica was getting her teaching certification, wanting to be the kind of teacher who notices when students are in trouble. Sophia was pre-med, determined to become a doctor who would listen to women instead of dismissing their pain. Lily had married someone kind, someone who valued her voice. She'd had a daughter and named her Maya, which made me cry when she told me. "Because you gave me back my life," she said, "and I want my daughter to grow up knowing what courage looks like." My mother published a memoir about her experience. 19 years of silence condensed into 200 pages of truth. It became a bestseller in our community, with women reading it and recognizing themselves, recognizing their mothers, recognizing a pain they'd thought was theirs alone but was actually shared by thousands. The book tour was hard for her, talking about such personal things to strangers. But it was also healing. Each person who came up to her and said, "Thank you for telling my story," helped close the wound that 19 years of silence had opened. My father didn't write a book, but he started facilitating support groups for men who were unlearning patriarchal programming. Men who wanted to be better husbands, better fathers, better humans. The groups were small, poorly attended at first. But they grew. Because there were other men like my father. Men who'd been taught wrong but wanted to do right. Men who were willing to do the hard work of change. Change was slow, painful, imperfect. But it was happening. One family at a time. One girl finding her voice at a time. One man choosing to listen at a time. 5 years after Sophia's failed wedding, we held a celebration. Not a wedding, not a funeral, but a ceremony of our own creation. The voicing. It was the opposite of the quieting. Instead of taking voices away, we celebrated them. Every girl in our network who'd reached 18 was invited to stand up and speak about what their voice meant to them, what they planned to do with it, how they'd use it to change the world. We held it at a community center in downtown Portland, the room packed with survivors and supporters. My grandmother, 92 now and still fierce, opened the ceremony. She spoke about silence and freedom, about the weight of stolen words and the lightness of finally speaking. For 45 years, I thought silence was my fate, she said, an inevitable burden that came with being born female in our family. But these girls, she gestured to all of us, they taught me that fate is just another word for the choices other people make for you. And you can always make different choices. One by one, girls stood up and spoke. Some read poems, some sang songs, some just talked about their dreams, their plans, their futures. Futures that belonged to them now. Futures they could speak into existence. Sophia spoke about medical school, about becoming a gynecologist who specialized in working with abuse survivors, about using her voice to amplify the voices of women who hadn't found theirs yet. Sarah spoke about law school, about fighting for immigrant girls in the legal system, about making sure that cultural defense could never be used to excuse harm. Jessica spoke about teaching, about creating classrooms where every student's voice was valued, about breaking cycles of silence in the next generation. When it was my turn, I stood in front of everyone who'd fought alongside me and everyone we'd saved, and I couldn't speak for a moment. Overcome by how far we'd come, by how many voices filled this room that should have been silent. I'm not special, I finally said. I was just a scared kid who couldn't stand to watch another girl lose her voice. But you all? You're the brave ones. Every single person who stood up, who spoke out, who refused to accept that silence was inevitable. You changed the world. Our world, at least. And that's everything. My mother spoke about rediscovering herself. My father spoke about learning to listen. Other parents spoke about breaking patterns, about choosing their children over tradition, about the terrifying freedom of making your own rules. The ceremony lasted hours. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. But they were good tears. Healing tears. The kind of tears that wash away old pain and make space for new growth. After the official ceremony ended, we had a party. Real food, real music, real joy. The kind of gathering our families used to have, but different now. Better, louder, full of women's voices and laughter and the beautiful noise of people who'd been told to be quiet finally making themselves heard. I stood in the corner with Alex, watching it all unfold, watching my grandmother dance with Sophia, watching my parents sway together, my mother's head on my father's shoulder, both of them looking peaceful in a way I'd never seen before, watching girls practice ASL with their parents, teaching them the language that had saved us. You did this, Alex said softly. I shook my head. We did this. All of us. It wasn't one person. It was everyone who chose courage over comfort. The traditional families weren't there, of course. The divide hadn't healed. Maybe it never would. Some wounds are too deep to close completely, but I'd made my peace with that. You can't force reconciliation with people who aren't sorry for the harm they've caused. But I'd heard through the grapevine that even in the traditional community, things were changing. Younger men questioning their fathers, daughters negotiating for more freedom. Some families quietly abandoning the quieting even if they wouldn't admit it publicly. Change was slow, but it was happening even there. As the party wound down, my grandmother pulled me aside. She pressed something into my hand. A small box. Inside was her red thread, the one she'd worn for 45 years. The one she'd finally cut off at that explosive family meeting 5 years ago. Keep this, she said. Not as a reminder of what was, but of what we overcame. So your children will know what their grandmother fought against. What you fought against. so they'll never take their voices for granted. I held the faded silk thread, this symbol of oppression that had become a symbol of resistance, of survival, of the moment everything changed. "Thank you," I whispered, "for finding your voice, for helping us find ours." She smiled. "Thank you for giving me a reason to use it. It's been 7 years since I stood up at Sophia's wedding and changed everything. 7 years since the day I chose speaking over silence, action over acceptance, courage over comfort. People often ask if I'd do it again, knowing what I know now, knowing the cost, the split family, the lost relationships, the years of struggle. The answer is always the same. Yes, absolutely yes. Because here's what I gained. My voice. My mother's voice. My grandmother's voice. The voices of 23 girls who might have been silenced forever. The ripple effect of courage that's still spreading, still saving lives, still changing families. Sophia graduated from college last month. She's starting medical school in the fall. She called me after the ceremony and we both cried. Happy tears this time. Tears of celebration for a future that almost wasn't. Sarah passed the bar exam. She's working for a nonprofit that provides legal services to immigrant women. She says every case she wins, she thinks about our network, about how we learn to fight back. My mother has her master's degree now. She teaches courses on trauma and recovery. She helps other women find their voices after years of silence. She says she's making up for lost time, and honestly, she's doing an amazing job. My father runs a support group with 20 regular members now. Men who are working to unlearn the toxic traditions they were raised with. He'll never fully erase the damage of his upbringing, but he's trying. That's all any of us can do. My grandmother passed away 2 years ago at 94. She died surrounded by love, by voices, ours and hers. Her last words were, "Keep talking," so we do. Voices Rising now operates in 7 states and has partnerships in 4 countries. We've helped over 800 girls escape harmful traditional practices. We've trained thousands of teachers, social workers, and healthcare providers to recognize and respond to cultural abuse. We're writing model legislation to prevent forced marriage and protect children from traditions that harm them. But the work isn't done. It never will be, really. Because for every girl we save, there's another one trapped in a system that tells her she doesn't matter. That her voice is worthless. That silence is strength. So we keep fighting. Keep speaking. Keep teaching girls that their voices are power, not poison. If you're reading this and you're facing something similar, here's what I want you to know. You're not alone. You're not powerless. And you deserve to be heard. Find your people. Build your network. Document everything. Know your rights. And when the moment comes, and it will come, choose courage. Your voice matters. Use it. And to anyone who thinks tradition justifies taking away someone's voice, their choice, their freedom, times are changing. We're changing them. One voice at a time. One choice at a time. One brave act of resistance at a time. The silence is breaking. Listen to the sound of it shattering. Listen to us rise.